Pues empezamos. Buenos días a todos y a todas. Primero me presento. Soy Mariña Fernández Salgado, profesora del Departamento de Economía de la Universidad de Alcalá, pero estoy de excedencia desde diciembre y trabajo en el Ministerio de Trabajo como asesora económica. Antes de estar en Alcalá, pues hice mi doctorado en la Universidad de Essex y estuve en el Departamento de Social and Policy Sciences en Bath durante unos años trabajando. Mi investigación se centra en el análisis de las desigualdades económicas y sociales, sobre todo a través del entendimiento del funcionamiento del mercado de trabajo. Entonces, ¿por qué estoy aquí? Bueno, porque justo antes de empezar en el ministerio, empecé a intentar entender y analizar los beneficios de las empresas individualizados. ¿Por qué? Porque normalmente en España, pero pasa en general, tenemos mucha información de lo que pasa en el mercado de trabajo del lado de la oferta de los trabajadores, pero no sabemos, lo que pasa en las empresas no es lo suficientemente transparente. Y nosotros sabemos que se están aumentando los beneficios empresariales y esto no se está reportando o no se está viendo ese efecto en los trabajadores. O sea, la remuneración de los trabajadores en el Producto Interior Bruto está por debajo del 50%. Entonces, entender qué es lo que está pasando con los beneficios y con cómo se está distribuyendo esta renta que se genera en las empresas es básico. Y también para la toma de decisiones dentro de las empresas. Una mayor transparencia nos va a permitir redistribuir pues la renta entre capital y trabajo, que ahora mismo pues está bastante mal distribuida. Entonces, por eso, aunque sea economista, vengo a presentar a una socióloga y luego a una jurista, creo que esta interdisciplinaridad pues, nos va a aportar mucho a la discusión. ¿Qué creemos? O sea, es necesario un cambio en la organización empresarial. De las empresas, sobre todo medianas y grandes, ¿no? O sea, tenemos que tener unas empresas más transparentes y más participadas, que es de lo que nos va a hablar Isabel. Y no solo por democracia, sino porque esto va a aumentar la productividad y la eficiencia dentro de las empresas, ¿vale? O sea, de hecho, y acabo con esto mi pequeña introducción, en el acuerdo de gobierno, y cito textualmente, decimos, en línea con el artículo 129 de la Constitución y en el marco del diálogo social, impulsaremos una participación más eficaz de las trabajadoras y trabajadores en el ámbito de sus respectivas empresas. Y para saber cómo llevarlo a cabo, pues tenemos a nuestra primera ponente, o darnos un poco de luz en cómo llevarla a cabo, que es Isabel Ferreras, que nos va a presentar la empresa como espacio político, el derecho a participar. Isabel Ferreras es profesora titular de la Fundación Nacional Belga para la Ciencia, es profesora de Sociología en la Universidad Católica de Louvain, donde imparte clases en el Departamento de Ciencias Sociales y Políticas, en el Instituto de Ciencias del Trabajo y en la Escuela de Economía de Lovaina. Isabel participa como investigadora permanente del CRIDIS y desde 2004 ha sido asociada del programa de trabajo y vida laboral en la Facultad de Derecho de Harvard, donde ahora es investigadora asociada senior. En la primavera del 2017, Isabel fue elegida miembro de la Real Academia de Ciencias, Humanidades y Bellas Artes de Bélgica, clase Tecnología y Sociedad. Y durante los años 2021 y 2022 fue la directora de la clase de Tecnología y Sociedad y presidenta de la Real Académica de Bélgica. O sea, tenemos una ponente excepcional. Y quizá como no somos mucha gente y saber un poco pues de dónde venís y por dónde vamos a dirigir la conversación, nos gustaría si os pudieseis presentar simplemente nombre y una línea para saber, bueno, quiénes somos.
Hola a todas. Bueno, pues hola a todas y todos. Mi nombre es Roberto, vengo de Valencia y nada, soy grado social y poco más. Me interesa mogollón cómo democratizar y participar en la empresa, así que estoy expectante a ver qué pasa y nada más.
Hola, buenas. Primero, muchas gracias por la ponencia. Yo soy Cintia, yo soy de Perú. Empecé a estudiar también el grado de Ciencias Sociales, Ciencias Políticas ahí en Perú y también aquí en España. Y luego terminé haciendo un máster en Sociología del Trabajo. Entonces me parece muy interesante lo que ahora vamos a venir hablando. Y también cómo generar, ¿no?, un espacio político, un espacio democratizado en la empresa, que es necesario. Y también viendo el enfoque que ponía Isabel. Nada, un gusto.
Yo soy Alex, he estudiado Ciencias Políticas y Filosofía y estoy terminando un máster de Análisis Político en la Complu y ahora mismo soy becario en el Centro de Investigaciones Sociológicas, aquí, en España. Y nada, o sea, yo estoy encantado con las jornadas y esto va a ser como otro puntito más que nos va a añadir como otro enfoque en el que creo que vamos a profundizar y bueno, estoy muy expectante, así que muchas gracias.
Hola, yo soy Ivana, yo vengo de México y bueno, actualmente estoy estudiando un máster en la Universidad de Sevilla de Relaciones Jurídico-Privadas. En México ya soy abogada y bueno, estoy muy ansiosa de ver todo este tema porque creo que nunca me había empapado tanto hasta que empecé en este curso.
Hola, bueno, lo primero agradecerles la ponencia que nos van a dar. Mi nombre es Pedro José y actualmente pues estoy estudiando la carrera de Derecho. Y bueno, la verdad que tanto las jornadas como la que tenemos hoy es un tema que me interesa mucho porque creo que en muchos ámbitos nos explica cómo funciona una empresa y ciertos aspectos importantes. Así que nada, agradecerles la ponencia y nada, gracias.
Bueno, mi nombre es David, vengo de Sevilla, actualmente curso cuarto de Psicología y soy asistente de investigación en un proyecto de familias transnacionales. Y sobre todo mi interés en este curso de formación es porque, bueno, por mi formación académica, los profesores, los docentes hablan poco del ámbito laboral de empresas, de cooperativas, de economía social y creo que es algo que se puede llegar a involucrar en el ámbito de la rama psicológica. Entonces, pues muchísimas gracias por la ponencia.
Bueno, hola, soy Milagros, yo también soy peruana. Yo estoy cursando también cuarto de Psicología y bueno, la verdad que no he estado muy enterada sobre estos temas y la verdad que me llamó mucho la atención en este curso y la verdad que estoy aprendiendo muchísimo.
Hola, buenos días. Mi nombre es Julián, soy de Colombia. Actualmente estoy realizando mi doctorado en Derecho Mercantil en la Pompeu Fabra en Barcelona. Mi proyecto de investigación se denomina Cumplimiento en Sostenibilidad y es entender bien qué es el cumplimiento y entender bien qué es la sostenibilidad para permitir esa transición verdaderamente sostenible de las empresas. He encontrado que el cumplimiento es un factor importante para desmitificar esa estricta responsabilidad legal y transitar hacia una responsabilidad política de las empresas. Entonces, me ha encantado estar acá, de participar y he aprendido pues mogollón. Gracias.
Pues hola, yo soy Sara, la fuente del Instituto Sindical Europeo y de la Universidad Libre de Bruselas. Voy a hablar luego, o sea que ya me conocéis de estos días y me alegro mucho de estar aquí y de escuchar de dónde sois también. La verdad que qué buena iniciativa.
Hola, buenos días. Yo soy Juan, soy de Madrid, de la Universidad de Mayores de la Universidad Complutense y la verdad es que estoy encantado de la oportunidad que me ha dado la Universidad Complutense para acercarme a temas que, bueno, cuando estaba en activo en el Grupo Santander era sindicalista y tuvimos algún tipo de democracia formal, pero únicamente formal, en temas como la salud laboral y luego en el Comité de Empresa Europeo, que eran espacios teóricamente de participación, pero bueno, la verdad es que hacían solo un lavado de marca, ni más ni menos. Muchas gracias por vuestras actuaciones.
Bueno, yo creo que ya me conocéis, soy Pedro, soy el secretario del curso. La verdad que en estos espacios, aparte del esfuerzo que uno pone para que las cosas salgan bien, yo me lo he pasado en grande, o sea, creo que ha sido un curso maravilloso desde el punto de vista del contenido. He aprendido mucho de vosotros y vosotras y os agradezco muchísimo el interés que habéis mostrado y la participación, o sea que eso también me lo llevo. Así que gracias a vosotros y a vosotras.
Bueno, Isabel, the floor is yours.
Voy a ver. Uy. A ver, porque sí, me entiendes bien, ¿verdad? Sí. Tengo que hablar muy bajo, porque bueno, estoy encantada de estar con vosotros y vosotras. Es un enorme placer, así que muchas gracias a Pedro por su invitación y a todos y todas de estar aquí para que pensamos el tema de la empresa como entidad política y las consecuencias que hay que pensar. Así que voy a hablar en inglés, porque mi castellano no es técnicamente perfecto, así que ahora prefiero hablar inglés. Es una buena ocasión por una universidad de verano, ¿verdad? Pero por favor, si os parece que hay algo que no es claro, me preguntan y a ver si puedo, traducimos ¿ok? Bueno, gracias. Así que, okay, so here's the outline, the different pieces that I would like to see with you this morning to get our mind around the firm as a political entity. And is the sound good or not? Yeah? Okay. So the first dimension is how should we describe the firm? What a firm is. Oh, thank you. Gracias. Este es mucho mejor. Gracias. What is a firm? And the proposition is to understand that we should understand the firm as a political entity. And when we see that, we understand much better the various challenges that firms face. They are much more than economic organizations, and this is really the foundational part of the rest of the thinking. The second point in my talk will be to look at the consequences of not treating firms as such, as being political entities. And we will see that it can only bring us to the situation in which we find ourselves today, which is the firm being the extractivist actor among all extractivist actors that you might imagine. There is not a better way to describe what firms are today than to say these are just extractivists vis-à-vis workers, vis-à-vis the planet, and vis-à-vis political democracy, actually. So what should we do given that situation? That's the third part. I will look at the history of the labor movement, what in labor history workers and their unions have been able to push for. And you will see that there is a really nice meeting point between the labor history and the history of democratic revolutions. That will bring me to suggest that we could move to democratize firms through what I call economic bicameralism. So bicameralismo en la empresa. And so I will finish with a few thoughts about, like, conceptually, what is the move that's needed here to really make sure we understand each other. And I can review a few more facts to justify the necessity to move. But we'll see about, I'll take my phone to make sure, no, where is it?
I can tell you.
Yeah, because I don't know where I put it. Okay, to make sure I don't speak for like 3 hours, and so it's like 45 minutes. Is that right?
20, yeah.
Yes. So, okay, I had a slide about where do I position myself as a researcher, because this is a summer school. And we, of course, as researchers, we position ourselves vis-à-vis the reality in a certain way, and it's important to be able to account for what you do. And so just to tell it very briefly, I am from a tradition of the critical sciences, which means that we look at the reality with a critical edge, which is that we try to develop our thinking with an expectation to contribute to people's emancipation, so the emancipation of individuals, the autonomy of individuals, but also collective autonomy. And that's the history of democracy. So the aim is that science will help democratic societies to better govern themselves so that they can really foster the emancipation of its members. Also, another important point is that my understanding of democracy is grounded in an understanding that is connected to the tradition of the pragmatism in political theory. So we don't see democracy as a one set of institutions that once and for all is good, and like you have the technical box, like a parliament, a government, and that's it. No, the idea is that democracy is best understood as a project. It's always dynamic, so this is why I try to speak more of the democratic project than democracy. And it is, in the words of Eric Olin Wright, a Marxist American sociologist, a project that always needs extension and deepening. So democracy as a project can only be nurtured, if you want, if we see it in a dynamic way as a project that basically goes to try to extend itself. So today the topic will be to extend democracy from the police, from the political sphere to the economy. And to deepen it means to find always better ways to practice representation. And for instance, today you have very interesting work and experimentation going on with lottery, the sortition, instead of election, as a way to choose representatives, but without the problems that the elections can generate. So democracy as a project in extension, in this deepening dynamic. So what do we mean with democratizing work, democratizing the firm? The grounding piece here, I think, is that it stems for a recognition that workers are investing themselves truly, deeply in their work. You cannot see workers not investing their own body first. This is what they bring to the work, their body, their mind, and it takes place all the time, every day. And when you think about capital investment, even though we speak of capital investment, it's actually something that is external to the people. It's not personal. The capital is some assets that people might have in the bank, but it's not a deeply personal investment. And so this is why I think it's actually conducive to speak or to use as synonym for workers, labor investors, to account for that dynamic experience of workers bringing in their work their entire person. And we've seen that with COVID. It was a big moment of recognition, I think, with the COVID pandemic, that workers who have been recognized as essential were actually those who were bringing their own, like, they're putting their physical health on the line. Of course, we've not done much based on that recognition, and this is what this work hopes to contribute to. It's the recognition that workers are bringing this very essential contribution to the possibility for the firm to exist Without their investment, there would be no firm. And the fact is that today, workers live in a very peculiar situation, because basically what I think we should see is that workers live in a situation of contradiction, a deep contradiction between the fact that in the police we are raised, now this young generation with us, they're raised by sort of, they are asked to experience themselves as reasonable citizens, contributing to society, being an equal in dignity and rights, as the first article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And then when they enter the workplace, people are told that that's not for the workplace. In the workplace, they should be obedient workers who are just there to be subordinated to the power of the firm or the management who represents the interest of the capital investors. And that is a situation of deep contradiction, and I've called that the contradiction between capitalism and democracy. And basically here I think it's very important to understand that capitalism and democracy are two possible regimes of government. We tend to think that they are not in conflict and that they're compatible, but actually when you really look at the structure of what is capitalism, and that's where the firm is playing a key role, capitalism is the connection of political rights with ownership. In capitalism, in the firm, who has the ownership of the shares in the corporation has the political right to govern the corporation. That's the regime of government of the capitalist regime of government. Democracy is another regime of government, is a regime of government where it's not based on our fortune, personal ownership, personal wealth. It's based on the recognition of each others as equals in dignity and rights. And based on that recognition of equality, we get each of us, like one person, one vote, and we co-govern the political entity. That's the ideal, of course. And of course, the political democracy is still, as we practice it today, is still in need of being deepened, okay, in the words of Eric Colin Wright. But there is this big contradiction, actually. And workers are really at the center of that contradiction. They are, at the same time, citizens in the political sphere, and they are subordinated in the economy, in the workplace. That's a very unsettled situation. And I think it's really key today to understand that we have to provide a positive, constructive solution to that tension, to that contradiction. And it has a lot to do with, for instance, the problem of the extreme right in the police. We know since the work of Karl Polanyi that when people feel totally disempowered, they will tend to turn to like big, strong men who will tell them, oh, the problem is easy, the problem is the migrant, the problem is the Jew, whatever, of the possibility to identify a scapegoat, while what people want at the heart is to have the means to govern their life, to have the means to be real citizens, actually. And so we find today we are in a situation where we should provide a positive, constructive, democratic answer to this problem of contradiction. And there is basically not many ways out of a contradiction. Either you go with more despotism, and that's the response, of course, of the far right to say, oh, I am going to be the strong man. I'm going to sort this mess, and you'll see the result. Or we go for the democratic route, and we try to practice and to extend the democratic project into the economy. So that's the perspective here. To democratize the firm. Yeah, so you see the definition. I define capitalism as the allocation of political rights tied to capital, and democracy, the allocation of rights based on or tied to equality. So workers are governed by the rules and decisions of the capital owners organized via the corporation. This is capitalism, right? And this is why like the corporation is the central institution of capitalism. I think in a much more defining way than markets. There's been on the left a big focus on markets and on criticizing the markets, and I think that's important. We should decommodify labor in many ways, but while doing that, there's been not enough focus on corporations. And corporations are the key institution where that inequality is made legal. And so it's time we address that problem. So workers have no say because they're not bringing capital, so it's logical. The corporation is not there to provide voice to anyone who is not bringing in capital. And by the way, that's not contentious. I'm not saying anything that is has an activist bent or a leftist bent, like legal scholars working in corporate law. This is what they say. The corporation is the structuring of the relationships between capital investors. And you will not hear about workers in that discussion because the corporation is not there to think about the relationship between capital owners and workers. So this is basically the graph, the structure of the firm, and I can share the slides if you want. David, I'll share the slides. But you're welcome to take pictures too, but you can, I'll give them to Pedro after. So this is the graph of the corporation, okay, Sociedad Mercantil. You have this assembly of shareholders who vote for a board, an executive a committee, which will basically convey the interest of the shareholders. It's meant to do that. And so when we are surprised or when you hear, when there is a massive layoff that's announced in the press or a big strike, people seem to be surprised that capital is making those decisions. But this is meant to be that way, so we shouldn't be surprised. And if this is not what we want, if this seems not just a way to arrange reality, then we should proceed differently and we should restructure, redesign firms. So, what is a firm then? So this is a bit of a theoretical, I'm sorry, a bit heavy slide, but just only read the red part if you want to read, but you don't even have to read. So the firm, I think, is better understood as a political entity. It's a political entity where there is an ongoing dispute over the goals pursued by the entity, by this collective endeavor. And there is constant negotiation about the means of the joint endeavor. So this is the reality of the firm. It's constantly in a firm, you constantly adjust, what's the business strategy, what are our new goals, how are we going to get there? There is this ongoing internal deliberation, if you want. The firm is made, actually, of two classes of investment. And we generally talk about capital investors, and they are the only ones who are recognized as being sort of legitimate to be named investors. But without labor investment, there would be just no firm, no service or no production. It's as simple as that. So in a capitalist firm, I'm not talking about a cooperative firm or just a capitalist firm needs the labor investment for itself to exist and to have anything to sell. So I suggest we should indeed recognize workers as the labor investors necessary for the firm to have anything to sell, and the labor investors are actually generally the only ones to be governed, to be subjected to the rules and decisions of the firm. Capital investors, they are impacted at best. But labor investors, they are literally governed. If you can have a nice work-life balance and take care of your children, it's because of the decisions of the firm. It's how you are literally governed in your everyday life through your work schedules. If you can dream of accessing a more interesting job position by attending some evening class and to retrain yourself, well, it will depend on the rules and decisions of the firm. If you have a stable schedule or not, that enables you to be able to train yourself. So literally, the labor investors are the ones who are governed by the firm. But they have no possibility to consent to that government, to those rules and decisions, because of the structure of labor law. The labor law makes it central that as a worker you are a subordinate, and the structure of corporate law, which grants the capital investors the governing rights. So, and as a side note, that's important, and we can come back to that, but there are so many dimensions here. But it's very important also to realize that today, in the context of transnational corporations, many workers, many labor investors, crucial for the firm, if you think about Apple, an Apple iPhone, for instance, it's manufactured in China by 500,000 workers working for a totally different entity than Apple, Foxconn, a Chinese company. Well, these workers, I think, should be rightly viewed as labor investing into Apple, because without their work, there would be no Apple product to be sold. So what do we do with those workers? And do we accept that through legal means, by cornering responsibilities, and say, okay, there is the Apple Corporation in California with its engineers, and then there is this totally distinct entity in China, and pretend it has nothing to do, just commercial contracts between them? I don't think that's enough. I think we should seriously think about the role that these workers in China plays for the wealth that's really accumulated at the on the Apple end of the supply chain, and recasting these workers as labor investing into Apple gives at least a direction for how critically we can think about Apple structuring and the responsibilities that Apple should have vis-à-vis these workers. But let me move. So by that I mean that the labor investment concept is also it's a descriptive concept, so that we can identify whose work is actually essential for the firm to have anything to sell. But it's also a critical concept, because by doing that you can actually criticize the reality, the status quo of the current legal arrangements, and criticize the way we currently structure firms, in a way that, even though firms talk about corporate social responsibility, they do not practice any form of serious corporate social responsibility. Workers in that sense, and it's a side note but quite important, are not stakeholders. They are the citizens of the political entity in which they are disenfranchised. They have not the standing of citizens in the firm, but they're not stakeholders. And today you have lots of talk about, capitalism taking care of all its stakeholders. We talk about stakeholder capitalism. This is like the new mantra of American-style capitalism. I think it's just a way to what I call droning workers into a notion of stakeholders. Because at the end of the day, what it does is to say, oh, but the firm has so many stakeholders. Of course the workers, but the environment, and then the suppliers, and then the local communities, etc., and our consumers. Of course, they are stakeholders. Well, then you have a firm which is then responsible vis-à-vis all these stakeholders, and who remains in the driver's seat? Capital investors. So that doesn't change much for workers, but for all the stakeholders as well. So what we face is what I think should be called economic despotism, is the despotism of this minority of ownership, the property owning class. Those who own the shares, they are the despots of the firm. And we should look at history, because in history we faced that situation many times. And this is the situation where property owners enjoy all the political rights. So we are going to do that. And the question is indeed, should we accept for longer that the inequality of political rights that we see in the economy continue? We would certainly not accept that anymore in the political sphere, even though, because of this contradiction and this battle that capitalism and democracy are fighting against each other, it's actually coming back in the political sphere. What we see in the US, for instance, is really the economic despotism, the magnitude of wealth that is actually accumulated in the economy, that is now coming back into the democratic political sphere, and it is threatening democracy. A guy like Donald Trump, for instance, or the Republican Party, is basically the vehicle for private wealth. There is no limit to what people can inject in terms of money into political cycles. And we know that these candidates, they are basically paid by these private interests. So political democracy is literally under threat of the economic despotism that is taking place in the economic sphere. So that's an additional reason to worry. There is the well-being of every worker. That's the basic sort of ethical core, I think, from my perspective, certainly. But you have certainly seen now through the course of the week that there are so many dimensions to this problem that converge around the idea of democratizing firms, because there are so many dimensions of concern that we can address through changing the structure of the firm. Yeah, we should not be surprised, right? Because we should not be surprised because the problems that we see today are really the output of the design of the firm. And the design is that it's extractivist by design, because capital owners are put in a position from which they can extract that value from workers, but also they are extractivists vis-à-vis the planet, obviously, because they should. Why would they care about the planet? And in a way, I think there is also a hopeful moment today, which is that at least some capitalists, they were not so much concerned about workers. You know, if workers would die in the mine, if you think about the history of coal mining, for instance, well, that's, that happens. It's too bad for the miner, but that's okay. The other day, there will be other human beings coming to take over that job position, because human beings are a renewable resources. But the planet, in some ways, because it's unique, because you really have to be completely out of your mind to believe that we're going to go to live on planet Mars or elsewhere. We don't have a planet B. This is a planet on which we have to live, because we only have one. Some part of the economic elites are now starting to understand that maybe, indeed, we should mind to get out of this extractivist regime, because it's conducive to destruction, as simply as that. So the consequence is that, you see the extractivism vis-à-vis workers, okay, and the big disconnect between the gains for capital vis-à-vis the gains for labor in the past decades is one proof for that. So the wealth is accumulated in the hands of capital owners, while it is at best, it's co-produced. There is no other way to see it. And you can see examples of more extraction going on even in the most advanced industries like artificial intelligence, where obviously you have firms like OpenAI with ChatGPT, which has formerly 700 workers. It's just nothing, right? Engineers in the US, but thousands of workers working, for instance, in Kenya to clean the data, to train the language model. But these workers are, as the case of Apple that I was saying, have nothing to do with OpenAI. No, they're just, contractors for that other firm. Well, that's like extractivist at its best. The consequences are very obvious on the destruction of the planet. Why would this extraction limit itself? And so here we are now with the six of the 9 planetary boundaries being now exceeded, which means that we don't face only a problem of CO2 emission. We face a problem of sheer extractivism and no respect for any of these planetary boundaries, the quality of the water in the ocean, the pollution in the air, all that. It's not CO2. So it's a huge, massive evidence for the need to change course, change rationality. And then we have the democratic collapse, because that despotism in the economy is only pushing political democracy to its limit, and people are more and more insecure, and they turn to the far right because they don't see any solid, sound way in the democratic spectrum to face those problems. And I think it's quite important to realize that my sense, and we have a lot of data survey also that gives really proof for that, people realized that there is a big problem going on, and that basically the political elites are a bit like puppets. They are not the real people deciding, right? It's like Elon Musk who decides, or these big names. Like the everyday person realized that. So it is about time that we face this problem seriously. And we should so address the root cause of it. And so if you want to address the problem is the unequal distribution of political rights in the economy, which you can call as synonyms as capitalist despotism or extractivism. Well, I think there is no better place to start with than the firm, because the firm is where this despotism is really legalized. I'm gonna skip this, I can come back. So now I'll turn to the next part, the transition path. What's super interesting is to see that actually the history, labor history, is conducive to this idea that workers should have standing as citizens in the firm, at the firm level. And you can see, if you look at the variety of countries, you can see that that's the sketch, right, of the corporation, stricto sensu. What has been plugged into the corporation from the side of workers' movement is actually an attempt to give workers standing into at the firm level. And let me show you a few more graphs. So this is versions of weak social democracies. I think we can we should include Spain in these situations, like countries like Belgium. There is no representation of workers at the board level, and there is a space through works councils, comité de empresas, where workers elect their own representatives to meet with management. But you see the line is in dot because it's not, it has nothing to do with co-decision. It is an information and consultation mechanism. It's interesting, workers get informed, but it's not super enthusiastic, right? Because apart from certain key concerns like health and safety, working time, etc., there are real negotiations going through collective bargaining that can happen. But apart from these very specific issues, there is no say for workers. This is a more interesting or more demanding situation, is the situation of Germany with co-determination. You've certainly already discussed that, but certainly I know Sarah is going to discuss co-determination in Germany. Co-determination in Germany is super interesting because it has practiced since the end of World War II, the recognition of workers as really constituent of the firm, because they are represented at the board, at the surveillance board, so the higher, so the most important hierarchical position in the firm, on a parity term, almost, with capital. So basically, workers provide for half of the board members, elected directly or through their unions, but the chair of that board is from the capital side, has also a casting vote, and is in addition to this 50% composition. So basically, whenever workers enter the meeting, they know that the capital side can have a win. They can win the vote. It's very important in terms of the recognition of workers. It's very important in terms of showing that that workers have been very serious about that. As you can see, Germany has the most important industrial, has been able to retain the most dense industrial sector across Europe. So that speaks for the fact that the capital investors have been anchored into Germany through Mitbestimmung in particular. But this is not enough. It's called false parity by the German scholars. It's not enough because it has been conducive also of scandals of corruptions, because as on the capital side, you can basically, you win over one workers' representative and you can tell everyone, oh, see, we have the most serious workers' representative voting with us. The other ones are really not serious. So it's not demanding enough. Plus, I think it does not provide for the ability of the labor investors to form their own views about the firm and defend it with a more demanding political power. This is super interesting. If you see it in a dynamic way, as is super interesting, the existence of European Works Councils, that has been going on since 1994. Juan, I think, has been a member of such a European Works Council. So across Europe, large corporations present in 2 countries at least, they have to get organized through the lines of, having elections in each plants, each location where the firm is present. Workers choose on unions list representatives, and they assemble in a European Works Councils to meet the top management at the European level. That's super interesting that this is happening, because to me it speaks to the intuition, again, of providing a channel for representation for the labor investors to meet with management. But again, this is an information and consultative mechanism. It's not strong enough in terms of el panel entrará en modo de suspensión. No, por favor, no. A ver. Okay. Oh, it's tactic. Okay. So, no. So, having that in mind, I suggest we should see this when we assemble all those fights, those struggles in the various countries where workers have been able to organize a political representation at the firm level. It actually meets the history of democratic revolutions. When you look at democratic revolutions, what you learn about is what I call a bicameral moment. It's a moment where the social tensions become so high that there is no productive, constructive way out other than expanding to the disenfranchised constituency, in this case workers, the same political weight than the one that was exercised previously by the property owning constituency on its own. So let me tell you about in the Roman antiquity. That's 494 before Christ, so it's a really long history of democracy, right? It just speaks for that strong intuition. Only the patricians were governing Rome, and at some point, the plebs, and the plebs was the merchants, the army, all those who were basically the essential workers, making it for Rome, making Rome working, actually. They basically waged a general strike, and it's Titus Livius who tells us about that story. The plebs got out of Rome and said, we are not going to obey anymore to your rules, except if we also get the right to validate these rules. So the veto right for the plebs was actually accepted by the patricians because they were forced to it, otherwise nothing was functioning anymore. And the plebs got basically the right to choose 2 representatives of the plebs, so the tribes of the plebs. It's the intuition of a second chamber, still 2 people, not a full chamber, but 2 people with veto power on the decisions that previously the patricians were allowed to take by themselves. In the modern case which speaks so well to the situation of the corporation, is the case of England, where you have a House of Lords, which was originally, it's no more today, but originally the House of Lords is the representation of those who own the land. And what do you find in the board of the corporation? The representation of those who own the shares, right? It's not the land, it's the shares of the corporation, but still it's the property that grants political right to stand in the House of Lords. And so the reasoning here is to think, well, where is the House of Commons? Where is the representation of those who invest their labor into the endeavor of the firm? Well, in labor history, we've seen that, we've seen the attempt, and the intuition is there. It's at the level of this Works Council ID. European Works Council at the firm level is the idea of providing a channel for representation for the workers to form their views and validate or veto the decisions that otherwise the representative of the property owning investors would make on their own. And this is then how we could picture the structuring of a bicameral firm. On the left side, you keep the same structuring. You don't touch, in a way, to the corporation, right? You have the shareholder general assembly, which appoint a board, which will have a majority vote power on the executive committee. This is what it is currently. But you give the same right to the labor investors. You recognize that they're member of this General Assembly of Labor Investors, and you allow them to elect or to choose by lottery, or that could be sites of innovation, how are workers going to send their own representatives through unions list. The role of unions is super important here, because I think they are the one who can ensure that democratization is going also to be hand in hand with more solidarity across all the working class through the various firms, and you grant them the same power as a board. So it's like you have a second board, and this can be also called a dual board, a dual majority board mechanism for the firm. We have affirmed that principle, actually, and so I mentioned it in our democratizing work initiative that we started at the beginning of the pandemic. If you want to go read it, it's on democratizingwork.org. Someter el gobierno empresarial, es decir, la dirección al más alto nivel, a un sistema de doble mayoría. La posibilidad de validar colectivamente tales decisiones. So the collective right to validate or veto the decisions of the firm, this can really be recognized as a threshold of democratization. It's getting the consent of the governed. And so you find that in the history of bicameralism. You find that, I'm sure Sarah will tell you, she has studied very closely the study of German Mitbestimmung, co-determination, and found that in a very specific case, there is that practice that was actually in effect. And this is also the core intuition that is at the heart of collective bargaining. And I think I want to, so this is our global network, Democratizing Work Network. And if you have interest into that, please go on the website and see about that. I will finish on collective bargaining, because that's very important in the conversation with unions in particular. But let me just say that the perspective that I have just laid out is a perspective of democratizing through the voice mechanism. Okay, it has precisely nothing to do with ownership, because we want to disconnect ownership with political right. This is a point made very central in Thomas Piketty, Capitalism and Ideology last book, that you can read the history of democracy as an attempt to disconnect those two. So workers do not need to have any capital investment in the firm to be legitimate to have voice in the firm. That's the part I just laid out. But if you want to think structurally about capitalism, you also have to wonder, what are we going to do with ownership? And we should democratize ownership as well. This is like the second rail of the railroad. And you need also a strategy for transferring the ownership. So a strategy on the ownership side. And let me just say that economic bicameralism is also a conducive way to think about that transfer of ownership, because what we could imagine is that if firms become co-governed through bicameralism, then workers' representatives and workers will see that they actually can manage this. They're good at governing because, of course, workers are the one who knows best about their industry in general, much better than people who come once per month sitting on a board and who might really not be of that industry. So sooner or later, the House of Labor Investors could be convinced that they can govern the firm pretty efficiently, and they don't need to grant any more political power to those who bring in capital, and that they could actually be much better off by getting loans for capital, or finding other ways to get capital in and buying back the shares from the capitalists. And this is a way to imagine a transfer of ownership that is going to go along the affirmation of voice and political rights. And if we look at this graph, then it speaks for the full transfer of ownership. Let's imagine workers then buy back the shares, and the chamber of capital investors disappear. They are freed from that investment to innovate elsewhere, because that's a theory, right? Like capitalists are good at innovation. Well, let's free capitalists so that they can go and innovate instead of staying, extracting rents in that firm. And here, then, this basically is the design of the worker cooperative. So it provides also a way to imagine a full transition of the economy, as capitalist as it is, to a democratic cooperative economy. Democracy in the firm. So this is my last part, because I know you've been talking with unions, and it's very, because this is like a university week, let's just take a step back to basically reason about what is the structure of the moves here. Basically, what I argue for is that two moves are needed from the traditional labor union strategy. It's been practiced by some unions, but it's clearly not been necessarily the current strategy because of the defensive situation in which unions find themselves in an era of neoliberalism, and we can perfectly understand that from a power analysis. But what I advocate for is that basically vertically, we need a move on vertically, if you want, that is, unions have tended to focus on collective bargaining at industry level to set the terms of the employment, and we can perfectly understand that, but we need absolutely that to go down, if you want, to the firm level, and to stop being afraid of deepening collective bargaining at the firm level, and institutionalizing democracy in the firm, at the firm level, is, I would argue, the strongest way to practice collective bargaining at the firm level. And horizontally, in terms of the topics that are bargained over, we absolutely need to understand that we should move from bargaining over the employment conditions to what we can call the labor conditions. That is, to govern the means and end of the labor investment. So let me just give a little bit more insight into this. So at the heart of collective bargaining, there is this central intuition of the collective veto power, same as in the history of bicameralism. That's workers need to be able to form their view about employment conditions historically and negotiate collectively in front of the representatives of capital. That's the collective bargaining in theory. So workers need to be able to form their view about employment conditions. That's originally like the core of it. So hiring and compensation, benefits, health and safety, and then dismissal. So what happens before getting employed, at the employment site, and when you are laid off, or the terms of separation. Well, the central intuition is more practiced at the industry level. There is a thick history of trying to practice it not only at the economy-wide level, national level, but also European level, and Sarah knows much better than me about that, but it's still weak, and weak also at the firm level, right? But so we should expand, like the intuition of collective bargaining should really be expanded along the whole vertical line of basically of the economic architecture. And in a service-based economy, I would argue that we should also extend the intuition in the sense of moving from strictly employment conditions to the labor conditions, the conditions of governing the labor investment, the means and ends of the labor investment. And let me just give two examples, because this is not theory. This is grounded in looking at what workers are expecting. Let's take the frontier industry, which is artificial intelligence. There was a month ago an open letter from workers from the big AI producers in California, workers asking to, you see, they do not believe that it's we, because they signed it, we do not believe bespoke structures of corporate governance are sufficient to change. Basically, they say, we are extremely worried, we know where are the problems, but because of the structure of corporate design, we as workers, we have no voice. And we cannot weigh in, and we want that, right? So we have these expectations. Workers are not saying, we want to be more compensated, we want less working hours. They say, we want to have a say on the means and ends of our labor investment. And for that, you need to change the corporate structure to give workers a full voice. In the context of the climate crisis, also, you see many workers' collective organizing themselves, challenging the strategies of firms. This is JKN collective in Florence, in Italy. They actually they are in an attempt to basically recuperate the firm and move it to the production of electric vehicles and really address the climate crisis. But this is one among many attempts where we see workers actually being the leaders in terms of change, being more aware of the problems than capitalists, because they want a strategy where their work is useful to the planet, but also their work is going to be maintained. Because the problem of not addressing the climate crisis is that in a matter of potentially a few years, there will be no more job in certain firms, like Nestlé, Nestlé Waters in Vittel in France. You have a big mobilization that's supported by unions, where workers have realized that the water source on which the plant is positioned, that is going to go extinct. There will be no more water in a few years. And they came up with a totally different industrial strategy to maintain, so to take care of the water source, which is the source of the existence of the firm. But management said, oh no, we cannot afford the investments that are necessary for the industrial process to be reshaped, because they can go with, closing the plant in 3 years. But workers do not want to go with that. So, I have still many facts, but 1 minute. Let me just finish here by saying that indeed, if we want to address both the climate crisis and what we can call the digital crisis, that is the crisis of what artificial intelligence means in terms of governing our present, our future, it's also absolutely key that we address the problem of the corporate design. So for all the reasons I said, this is central to a potentially democratic future and sustainable future. Thank you so much.
Muchísimas gracias, Isabel. Ha sido interesantísimo. Yo, sobre todo desde una perspectiva como economista, verte presentar me ha encantado. Ahora tenemos 15 minutos así para preguntas. Sí, 20 minutos para preguntas. Adelante. No sé si quieres, os llevo... Tengo una ahí detrás. Bueno, yo primero me he visto, David.
Gracias.
Sí.
Vale. Vale. Bueno, en primer lugar, agradecerle sobre todo la ponencia, ¿no? Y más en lo personal, en cuanto a que no tengo una formación específica en economía, entonces siempre se agradece estos foros para complementar esa formación que me falta. Lo que le quería preguntar es si usted considera viable a corto plazo tomar medidas para concienciar a la ciudadanía española sobre la importancia de la participación democrática, tomando en cuenta prácticas y experiencias internacionales. Y la segunda pregunta, más enfocada en un grupo joven, de un sector joven, es cómo la juventud desinteresada en cuanto a estos asuntos podrían llegar a aprender de otros países para fortalecer nuestra democracia y fomentar una cultura de participación activa. Me refiero a personas jóvenes que, por cuestiones a lo mejor de precariedad laboral o cuestiones de que bueno, en la vida no le da más, por así decirlo, no tiene esos espacios para venir a estos foros académicos, como de una manera pedagógica, del tú a tú, puedo yo explicarle lo fundamental que sería la participación en las empresas de manera democrática.
Bueno, muchas gracias, David. I guess three points, but it's clearly not sufficient to address your concerns, which are great concerns. So I think university education has a huge responsibility, because that would be the place where we could teach about this alternative history, if you want, about all the cases that are going on, where researchers have some knowledge about, and teach differently about, what is a firm. That's so important, because a lot of talks we hear is that when people spend 4 years being told that it's just normal that corporate leaders choose and that workers are subordinates, it becomes naturalized. And that's the biggest fight, I guess, is to constantly question this. These are about societal choices, and there is nothing natural with the market or the corporation as they work, right? So academic training is super important, and the way we design our programs is extremely important. And I think that we can see a bit of progress given the climate crisis. I would say all that's related to sustainability studies, and in that corner of university education, there's been lots of innovative things going on, but it's clearly not enough. I also think that it's very important that we make known the examples of such leadership by workers, by unions, and sometimes they are not even known from the union leaders themselves. So I know, for instance, Sarah has organized a super important day, a study day at the European Trade Union Institute, to have the voice of these local leaders, if you would like to call them that way, who are making or embedded in these fights to make them speak about what they do and to make that known from the leadership. There is a very important sort of cognitive battle here, which is about really getting to know about these cases, speaking about them. Also, I would say some journalists are doing some really great work. I don't know in Spain, and I would love to know, and you can tell me at the break, if you have certain media in mind where they're doing interesting work. But in France, in Belgium, in the UK, in the US, I can clearly see some media really having expert journalists basically going after these cases to try to highlight them, to show that another sort of path is possible. And then the third bit, I would say, is to encourage, I think, the youth who has an interest already in those questions are probably more drawn to the cooperative social economy experimentations and world of work. And it's clearly a minority chunk of the economy, but it's super important for the reason that it is prefigurative, in the sense that it's prefigure the world as we would like to see it, democratically run in the economy, mindful of planetary boundaries, regenerative most often. And so I think that is an important side of practicing this principle. But my call to the social economy world would be to envision themselves as part of this long what I call the democratic transition trajectory of the economy. Because often this is a world which, being so under threat by the capitalist principles, it's a world that sort of lives on itself, or even try to make a secession from the capitalist economy, saying, oh, but we are so different, we don't want to have anything to do with the economy. And what I try to contribute with my work is to understand the challenge a bit differently, by saying, actually, this is more like the end point or the direction of change. And it's very important that we see that it's practiced, it has its own challenge. Nothing is all, working fine in every cooperative, for instance, but it's still the right direction. And so what we want to see is a trajectory of transition that as capitalist firm like Coca-Cola, we would like to see Coca-Cola transition through the voice avenue and through the property avenue, so that it becomes a democratically run firm. And that will probably mean cut down in terms of transnationalization, becoming more small scale, etc. This will be all part of the unfolding story, but we absolutely need a trajectory for the whole economy. And so far, it's been really sort of like two different stories, because the cooperative social economy world is as old as the capitalist history, like 200 centuries and more of functioning, but in that little corner. And let's try to project a sort of a unifying vision in terms of transitioning the whole economy so that it becomes sustainable and democratic.
Pedro, tengo tantas preguntas.
Yo también seguro me da la mesa y tiro, yo me toca a mí.
Sí, oye, no, muchas gracias, de verdad que estoy acá encantado. Tengo varias preguntas y bueno, ya dependiendo del tiempo, pues ya verás.
Sí, te escucho.
Pues una, digamos que yo le he denominado la dependencia emocional de la sostenibilidad. Y un poco, hoy existen estos términos de empresa de propósito, economía de propósito. existe lo que se llama los factores ESG, ¿cierto? Y entonces dentro de la S, lo social está trabajar por la diversidad, la inclusión, no dejar nadie atrás, pero ninguno de estas situaciones trata, digamos, el tema de democracia, ¿cierto? Y lo que genera es un lenguaje que ayer me enseñaba Alex, ¿cierto? El tema del lenguaje performativo que genera es un lenguaje de dependencia emocional de los jóvenes, sobre todo, a la sostenibilidad sin cuestionarse estos temas. Eso por un lado. Y por el otro, pues el fenómeno de anti-ESG en Estados Unidos, ¿cierto? Que lo que pasa es que genera otra dependencia emocional a la sostenibilidad porque se fundamenta en la competitividad de los mercados. Entonces dicen, no, es que no, y pasó con los agricultores acá en Francia, ¿cierto? Es decir, no podemos establecer normas ambientales o más sociales porque nos quedamos por fuera del mercado de China. Entonces hay que fortalecer los mercados y en última instancia es fortalecer las empresas, pero nadie trata de la democracia, ¿cierto? Entonces, digamos, es una reflexión pues que hago que me parece interesante. Varias preguntas. La primera es, desde tu teoría, ¿cómo tratas el deber de los administradores, ¿cierto? Porque yo en los foros que me encuentro, la explicación que me dicen mis colegas mercantilistas es que escuchar otras voces es de alguna manera permitir que el administrador se justifique su decisión y que sea una decisión, ellos utilizan la expresión hasta más corrupta, ¿cierto? Es decir, que el administrador al justificar que va a tomar una decisión porque lo están diciendo los trabajadores, pues de alguna manera puede ir en contra del interés de esa otra cámara, ¿cierto? Y eso genere, digamos, problemas en la toma de decisión y sobre todo el business judgment rule, ¿cierto? Que se justifica. Entonces, ¿cómo piensas ese deber de los administradores en esta bicameral economy que me parece genial? La segunda cuestión que me encuentro yo con mis colegas mercantilistas es, ¿esta reforma la hacemos vía reforma de las normas corporativas o tendrá que ser vía reforma de otras normas por fuera? Y esta es una discusión grandísima porque de alguna manera pues lo que yo he visto es hay una resistencia a reformar el derecho de sociedades, ¿cierto? Y claro, y cuando uno trae estas reflexiones dicen no, es que el derecho de sociedades es especial, la especialidad del derecho de sociedades que viene desde la idea de los mercantilistas del siglo XV, ¿cierto? Y esa especialidad es como caída del cielo. Entonces uno dice, bueno, ¿por dónde me meto? ¿Cierto? Entonces reformo por la vía laboral y cuando reformo por la vía laboral se ve como ideología o tenemos que buscar otra manera, ¿cierto? Esa es una reflexión. Otra pregunta y demás es, no sé si en tus reflexiones has tenido como una especie de, ¿cuál es la lista de temas, ¿cierto? Que tiene que tratar estas dos cámaras, ¿cierto? Obviamente hubo una lógica después el nombramiento de los miembros del consejo, pero claro, cuando uno trabaja en gobierno corporativo, es que, o sea, yo llevo muchos años trabajando en gobierno corporativo y uno va y compra una empresa, pues lo primero que hace es un acuerdo de listas de cuáles van a ser las decisiones que los accionistas deben tomar. Entonces uno dice, esa lista, ¿por qué no mismo se utilizan en estas dos cámaras, ¿cierto? O sea, una fusión. Entonces, bueno, yo mencionaba, de pronto Sara me escuchó alguna vez, acá en España se traspuso la directiva de las reformas societarias estructurales. Y claro, y esto se vendió pues como un gran éxito, que porque le da mayor participación a los trabajadores. Pero tiene Pedro un pecado, porque dice que una vez inscrita la reforma, pensemos en una transformación, una fusión, una vez inscrita la reforma en el registro mercantil, no tiene reversa. Eso es lo que dice la ley. Entonces, ¿qué dicen mis colegas mercantilistas? No, usted haga toda la reforma y inscríbela y a los trabajadores le cuenta después, porque cuando ellos ya pongan problema, pues ya está escrita, ¿cierto? Entonces, digamos, de alguna manera, ¿cuáles son esas listas, esos temas que de pronto salen? Bueno, no, dejo ahí porque si no...
Bueno, sí, Julián, nos vamos a hablar después porque hay tantas cosas. So let me make 4 points. The first one, I'll take by the reverse order because I think it helps follow the course of reasoning. So the first one is that, in my understanding, all topics that are dealt with at the board level will have to be dealt with at this bicameral board level, okay? So what the board of a corporation is doing is to validate the business strategy, to validate what's the return for capital investors, or that's even the General Assembly of shareholders. Well, that will be at the level of the General Assemblies of workers. They will have to validate dividends for shareholders. And the idea here is that if you basically replicate on the labor side what happens on the capital side already, you will end up with substantially very different decisions. Because let's take the profit, what we do with profit example. If the capital side wants to feed itself some dividends, well, if he needs 50% plus one representatives on the labor side to agree on that, probably we can anticipate that workers will say, well, wait a minute, okay, you want dividends, but we would like higher wages, maybe, or maybe not, that's not the priority. We want more job positions opened. We want to be more to do the work because we are overworked. Or we want job trainings, or we want an interesting investment that's very costly, but that we think is going to be good for the company, and apparently you don't want to make that investment. So that dynamic of bargaining between capital and labor is what ultimately this is after. It's to institutionalize the conflict in a way that takes place between capital and labor. In that I'm very Marxist. I think there are vastly different types of interests driving workers than those who drive the capital investors, certainly in a financial capitalism as we know it today. And we want to organize the discussion between them so that workers are put in a position where they can basically say, no, we don't want that. And you have to come up with a better proposition. And what happens then is that the executive committee, the CEO of the firm, becomes some sort of a political broker. He will have to find the agreements. He will have to be the one, knowing what the workers want, knowing what the capital side wants, and, get them to agree on a plan. That will have to be much more balanced than what we can see today, right? So I would say substantively, it's just the same topics that we see discussed at the board level, at the General Assembly level. You just extend the constituency that will have a say on those topics. And because there is this bet on what we can call the epistemic superiority also here of democracy. That is, when you extend the demos, you will have indeed various concerns that were not already internalized by capital investors, clearly. What the surrounding areas around the plants, what do they look like? They look like horrible places, or because workers live there and actually spend their time there, they will say, okay, we want a major investment into regeneration of our local environment, planting trees, or that. So you want to change the content of substantively of what are the legitimate topics. And this is, I think, the way to do it is by granting this ability for workers to bargain over what is only now in the hands of the capital side. Which means that I don't know what is the actual, if you want to think in terms of actual reforms, I'm agnostic, I would say, in terms of the best means to get there. And what I know for sure is that lawyers, legal scholars, are like the best to specialize and hyper-specialize like every subfield possible. And so we can clearly see that the firm is really sort of torn apart between corporate law, labor law, financial regulation. Like there are many different bodies of law that really basically define what the firm is, what it can do, etc. And that in a bit of a suspicious, attitude, we could see that and feel like maybe this is a bit by design. It's a way to make the firm a bit difficult to manage because it's so torn apart by these various bodies of law. So I think that there is one way to go, which would be to really imagine the law of the firm in a much more encompassing way, to try to reassemble the different bodies of the law. That seems to me quite Don Quixote-esque adventure. Another way to go could be to say we will not change corporate law. As you said, mercantilist, they're very, like, they will always say it's just so difficult, etc. No, let's keep all the structuring of the capital side as is, but let's just plug in the structuring of the labor side. It's like that's where thinking about the political history is conducive, because when you think about the bylaws of the House of Lords, the House of Lords is an institution in itself. It works through its own, functioning rules, and it exists, right? But then there is also the House of Commons, there is also the King, and we can have all those plugins, and say to the corporation, okay, the capital side is structured as it is. Let's continue. Let's have you have your own internal, discussion among capitalists. How do you want to organize yourself? There are B class actions, there are C class actions, even within capital, what they call corporate democracy. They have their own struggles. Let's have them organize as they want, but make it very clear that there is not only that, and that they should interact with workers through labor law, organized in a different way. So that's another possibility, but clearly it's a site of also imagination, and I'm very happy to hear more from what you think. And maybe a last point, because the time is pressing, but I think in terms of, so there is this big hurdle, which is fiduciary duty, as we call it in English. So it's the idea that the administrators, the members of the executive committee, and the members of the board, most importantly, should care for the interest of the capital investors first and foremost. That, I think, is something indeed that is untenable in a climate crisis. And so even in the US, there are very big, important discussions going on at this moment about that. It's untenable. The problem is that the structure of the US law is because it's common law, and we cannot change it by law in Congress, and it's all dependent on the judges in the various 50 states of the US. It's actually extremely difficult to see a path out of the primacy of the fiduciary duty in the US. I think from that perspective, European countries are in a much better position, because we could, by law, restructure the finality, the ends that any firm sets to itself by saying that just valuing the interest of capital is not enough, and there are many ways to do that. But indeed, at some point, it will involve a discussion with corporate law, right? But I don't see a really way out of this trap in which we find ourselves without addressing the need to balance fiduciary duty with other types of duties. Thank you.
Una pregunta corta.
Sí,
No nos queda mucho tiempo.
O sea, pregunta una frase. Ay, espera, que tengo. ¿Quién paga?
Sí, los dos.
Hostia, tú.
Oh, sí.
Podemos luego extender preguntas, vamos, que voy yo detrás, o sea que por mí.
Sí. No, y yo me quedo después, así que podemos también hablar después de la segunda conferencia.
Es
Sí,
que,
sí.
a ver, realmente lo mío es más una reflexión a lo largo de estos días. Y
Perfecto.
contigo. Pero entonces
Sí.
no sé si mejor hablarlo después o...
No, comparte.
Vale, pues yo quería comentar que me parece muy interesante democratizar la empresa. Sin embargo, yo me cuestiono de cómo podemos democratizar la empresa si al inicio, cuando entramos al mercado laboral, seguimos reproduciendo dinámicas, actitudes, comportamientos de que realmente no hay una democracia, sino que los jóvenes no tenemos la suficiente capacidad dentro de los espacios laborales a los que entramos para poder nosotros tomar decisiones o quizás criterios o ya incluso dar valoraciones o dar algún tipo de ideas para mejorar una empresa, un lugar, un espacio donde trabajemos. Entonces, me parece interesante que hablemos de democratizar la empresa, pero si desde el inicio estamos condicionados bajo políticas o dinámicas que se han establecido a lo largo de muchos años y que son prácticamente ya casi tradicionales y que se llama como esta... cuando, o sea, en Perú, por ejemplo, se llama pagar sueldo, que tú como al inicio de entrar a un trabajo por primera vez, eres el nuevo, entonces tienes que acostumbrarte a algunas dinámicas como, hey, que me tengo que quedar más tarde o me tengo que... entonces, me parece interesante que podamos construir dinámicas y teorías sobre cómo la coagencia o la cogestión, exacto. Pero cuando estamos tan condicionados desde jóvenes, me parece un poco que no se va a la raíz del problema, ¿no? Y ya yendo un poco más atrás, cómo podemos también democratizar nuestras propias vidas si están atravesadas por la economía y si nuestras propias decisiones dependen mucho de si me favorece o no me favorece o si es útil individualmente para mí o para mi grupo. Entonces, como que está tan interiorizado en nuestra forma de vida occidental en la que vivimos actualmente y en nuestro ritmo de vida y en el sistema capitalista que considero a veces que como una política en un momento exacto y en un espacio concreto a veces quizás no pueda dar los mejores resultados si no hay como con políticas integradas alrededor en diferentes aspectos, ya sea en la educación, ya sea en la sociedad, ya sea y lo que hablábamos también, ¿no?, de la renta básica universal, de cómo poder solventar a todas estas personas que quizás están entrando pero no tienen la suficiente agencia social o cultural como para sentirse cómodos en un espacio de trabajo, ya sea, no sé, si soy yo de Derecho y mi familia, nadie ha estudiado en una universidad, eso es, para mí va a ser mucho más complicado llegar a espacios muchos más altos de élite que demás personas que sí que se han circulado a lo largo de su vida y han vivido bajo ese sistema, ¿no?, que es mucho más sencillo. Entonces creo que también es una cuestión cultural y social que es importante también verlo y verlo desde diferentes enfoques, no sé. Eso nada.
Sí, gracias.
Nada, yo era algo más crematístico. Es que ¿quién paga todo esto? O sea... ¿Quién paga ¿Quién paga la estructura de la nueva Cámara? ¿Es una participación de capital público, de dinero público, propio que tengan los sindicatos, o la empresa tiene que poner para que exista, o la empresa, el ámbito empresarial tiene que poner dinero para que haya una democratización que creo que va en contra de sus intereses? Solo es eso. Gracias.
Gracias. Sí, bueno, sobre la cuestión del funding the transition, the democratic transition, I think there are many dimensions to this, but certainly I think the tax code would be a perfect site of intervention, because we give tax breaks, tax incentives to corporations for many reasons, and actually giving them for democratizing themselves would be actually a really greatly aligned tax incentive with the overall goals of a democratic society. So I would go for there, but we can discuss more, because the details of this are pretty important indeed if we want to push for that. But obviously I cannot not mention the remuneration of capital, which is really excessive today, and which could go, certainly for the large enterprises, into indeed the funding of the work of such a second chamber. Although, because this is not, there is nothing new in sense of the topics, and all the work is done for one chamber. So it's not it's not going to cost an immense amount to have it run, to have all the paperwork going to a second chamber. So, but that if it were the conversation, if we would be all obsessed about, how are we going to take that cost into share? How are we going to share for that cost? It would be fantastic, right? That would be a great world. So, Cynthia, about your thoughts, thank you very much. I totally agree that thinking about democratizing work is not done in a vacuum, and certainly it's part of a project of democratizing society, and thinking about how we can empower all equal human beings to live an emancipated life. And that requires resources, functioning, capabilities, in an Amartya Sen perspective, which I think nicely tie the political sort of ideal with the practicalities. And so I would get your attention to two things. One is indeed the family structure, as Adorno, the famous book of Adorno about the authoritarian personality. It's clear that we are trained to accept the despotism from the family side on. This is why it's so fundamental to wage the fight for equality among men and women, because that's where the culture of equality and of deliberation can actually be practiced, and what we let our children see, and also see that it's difficult and the parents do not always agree. There are conflicts, and how are we capable to overcome these conflicts and find a positive way out instead of going immediately for the divorce? I mean, this is all very relevant, absolutely. And second point, because I did not mention that, and that's very important to the whole thinking about the challenge, and this is the second principle that we put forth in the Democratizing Work Manifesto. So it's democratizing firms, but it's decommodifying labor to decarbonize the planet. But decommodifying labor is central to this piece, which means to offer basically workers always a public option through a job guarantee, that a job that they can participate to shape themselves. And there are a lot of experimentation around the globe in terms of job guarantee design that are very hopeful, because we could imagine indeed that a progressive way to organize society is to ensure that every one of us can have a public option for a job position, and that will obviously change totally the dynamic on the so-called labor market, because the reserve army, to speak in Marx's term, would be non-existent. And we know that by putting a firm threshold on that so-called labor market, we will give workers much better options, and we will force private employers to compete for the best working positions, actually, right? So to elevate the whole of the labor market instead of pushing now in a course to the bottom. So that's very much part of, like, the interaction between those two principles is very important in the overall design, I think, of such a democratic and sustainable economy. Thank you. Thank you so much. Oh, and yeah, and I should just, me permite mention. So, tenemos un nuevo libro en castellano que se va a salir este verano, que es mi primer libro en castellano, Democratizar la empresa capitalista, piedra angular de una prosperidad compartida y sostenible, que va a salir a Ariadna, que es en Chile, y tiene un epílogo por Pedro y Sara, así que muchas gracias, y que conecta con el trabajo aquí de Yolanda Díaz y el liderazgo español al nivel europeo. Se va a hacer gratis, la versión electrónica será gratis, así que aproveche. Sí.
Nos vemos de vuelta y cuarto aquí. Muchas gracias.